How's everybody doing today? So, initially, this second video on this channel was going to be a continue of the histories and explanations of the amendment, which would have continued with the Second Amendment. However, that is a very important, pivotal cornerstone of the United States of America, just like the First Amendment was, which is why I started with the First Amendment. However, I don't have the time to research and lay that out properly at this moment or today. So I have decided to talk about what is still a very important concept to our government, but something that I feel can be explained much more easily and doesn't require quite as much research to get right. So today, what I'm going to be discussing is the history and reasons behind presidential term limits. So, to begin this conversation, I have to acknowledge or point out the fact that presidential term limits exist because of the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution. However, this is not going to be a histories and explanation video. When I do get to the 22nd Amendment, that video will dive much more deeply into the actual language of the 22nd Amendment and explaining the nuances and details a little bit more specifically. Instead, in this video, we're actually going to be looking more at the concept of presidential term limits and the actual history of them, because in a way they go back to the very beginning of this country, even before the 22nd Amendment existed. And what I mean is this. See, remember that just like in the video on the First Amendment, a lot of the different details and specifics of that amendment we can see come from the direct experiences that the Founding Fathers had separating themselves from the monarchy of England. And this is much the same when it comes to presidential term limits. See, our very first president, George Washington, was president at a time when there was no presidential term limits, of course, because he was the very first president. This had never been done before. So he decided at the end of his second term as president not to run for a third term. It is pretty well believed that the reason he made this decision was to avoid a situation where you are basically replacing one monarch with another. In other words, leaving King George and creating King George Washington. So, in order to allow free democracy to take its place, he chose not to run for a third term in office. Now, this pattern kind of became the de facto policy, and no president ever felt the need or desire to go against this policy, or the citizens did not allow it to happen until Franklin Roosevelt. Now, Franklin Roosevelt was actually elected to the presidency 4 times, and he served 3 of those terms to completion, and died during his 4th term in office. Now, this was a big factor in the creation of the 22nd Amendment. Now, it is very much my desire that this channel be free of political bias in one direction or the other. I have other channels and outlets for that type of content. However, I would like to make it known, just so you understand my perspective when I'm explaining this, that I really feel that Franklin Roosevelt was very much one of the more harmful presidents to our country. He did a lot of things that I personally feel really damaged our country, especially when it comes to the future and down the road. However, with that being said, I would like to say that I do understand the justification for Franklin Roosevelt breaking the unwritten rule of a president not serving more than 2 terms. See, you have to understand that when Franklin Roosevelt was serving as president, it was an incredibly trying time for our country. He came into the presidency pretty much at the height of the Great Depression and continued to serve as president through World War II. And Franklin Roosevelt felt that with this massive global conflict going on, and with America being embroiled in a very serious war on 3 fronts, Africa, Europe, and Asia, or the Pacific more accurately, I guess you could say, he believed that it was not a good time to have a change of leadership or a change of power. That America needed to remain in the same hands. However, I think that there were probably a lot of people within the government who saw this as somewhat of a manipulation of the track record of incumbents in elections. The reason I say this, and understand that I'm trying to explain the thoughts that may have been going through the head of congressmen and senators at the time that the 22nd Amendment was created. But, obviously I have no way of reading these people's minds. But it is pretty obvious to see, if you look back through the history of presidential and even gubernatorial elections in the United States, that incumbent candidates have a very high probability of success when running in an election. So you can see that there is the possibility that if term limits for the president are not actually made into law, as they were when the 22nd Amendment was ratified, there is the possibility that one person could just continuously be reelected president over and over again. And who knows if that would have been the case with Franklin Roosevelt had he not passed away. There is the possibility that he could have been elected for a 5th, 6th, 7th, or even 8th term in office. And while Franklin Roosevelt may not himself have misused that extended period of regency over the country, somebody else in the future may have. So it was very important that once it was illustrated that there was the distinct possibility that somebody could in fact run for a 3rd term in office and win, the members of the government at the time felt it was important to make the formally unwritten rule of 2 terms for president into an actual amendment to the Constitution, and therein the 22nd Amendment was born. Now, to explain this a little bit better, in terms you may understand, or that may be easier for you to grasp, we can see that over the last 9 or 10 years, actually going back even further than that, all the way to Bush, and then Obama, and now Trump, we have had a series of presidents who are the country is very divided on. While a lot of people were very much behind George W. Bush being president, there were also a lot of people who very much disliked the fact that he had become president and the decisions that he made as president. But as it's very hard for a non-incumbent candidate to defeat an incumbent candidate, especially in a presidential election, it very incredibly rarely happens. The only way that President George W. Bush was going to leave the office was to not run for an election. And so when the term limits ended, President Barack Obama was elected. And very much the same way as President George W. Bush, the nation was very divided about President Obama. There were people who were very, very fond of President Obama, and also people that thought he was an absolutely terrible president and were very unhappy with him being in office. You start to see a pattern here. So, again though, because of the difficulty of defeating an incumbent presidential candidate in an election, he was probably not going to leave the White House unless he did not run for re-election. So he ran out his 2 terms, and then Donald Trump was elected. Now, Donald Trump has not even ended his 1st term. As a matter of fact, at the time that I'm making this video, it is still very early into his presidency. But you can still see that the nation is very divided. There are a lot of people who are very strongly behind President Trump. And there are a lot of people who are very strongly against him. There are very, very few people in the middle who don't really care one way or the other. So, if you think about that, no matter which side that you fall on, or what your political beliefs are, one of these 3 men that I just mentioned, President Trump, President Obama, President George W. Bush, you could imagine that out of one of those 3 guys, there is probably a man that you really would have been unhappy as having as president. So just imagine a world where that man continued to be president for the rest of his natural life. I'm sure you would be very unhappy with those circumstances. I know I would. See, that's why the term limits are important. Because prior to, the concept of democracy and the formation of the United States of America, of course, there were democracies prior to America, if we look back into Roman and even somewhat Greek times. But in modern times, we were very much the first democracy, the first modern democracy. So, because of that, the Founding Fathers existed in a world where kings were basically kings until they either died and passed their crown onto their son or whoever their heir may be, or were deposed through a military coup. That was how things were done. And that's why George Washington wanted to really break that mold, and why he chose not to run for a 3rd term in office. Because he really wanted America to be different. And you can kind of imagine that that same thought would have been in the minds of many of the early presidents who had grown up and existed in that same world. But by the time we get to President Roosevelt, that's kind of more the past. That's the old days. That's not something that President Roosevelt ever would have experienced firsthand in his lifetime. So that's why at that point in time, it became obvious that the term limits needed to be made into law. Because as we got further and further on into time, that concept would have become more and more ethereal and harder to imagine for the people living in that day and age. And if the term limits were not made mandatory, there is the possibility that somebody down the road could have taken advantage of that and very much set up their own monarchy here in the United States, even if they were initially elected through due democratic process. So that's all I have to say about that. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. As you can hear, there's a storm rolling in, so it's a good time to cut it off anyway, because I don't want to have to talk over the thunder. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it, or if it helped you out with your history paper. Subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Share it out if you know somebody that may benefit from hearing about this. You guys have a great week. I will see you in the next video. Peace.